through history the vampire has appeared in one form or another in myths and legend all over the world. Of all the supernatural creatures, the vampire has fascinated man like no other, inspiring him in both literature and art, and oh, of course, films. I am Davida Farranta, a psychic investigator, and over 20 years ago I began an investigation into what was one of the most chilling accounts of vampirism in the 20th century, the case of the Highgate vampire. Events really began at Highgate Cemetery in the late 1969. Local reports were circulating about a tall, dark figure that had been seen in and around Highgate Cemetery. It invariably took the shape of a tall figure, and many witnesses described it as wearing a cloak. Apart from this, many people remarked on its eyes. One old lady that I interviewed personally in 1969, for example, was walking her dog up Swains Lane late at night, and suddenly, when she reached the main gate, the dog suddenly stopped and refused to go any further. It whined and it turned around and it tried to retreat. At this moment the old lady looked up, and just inside the main gate she described a tall, dark figure with glaring red eyes, which seemed to be floating towards her. Obviously she didn't stay much longer than that, and she quickly went back down Swains Lane with her dog. She also told me that the surrounding area had turned icy cold. Then again there was the case of a 45-year-old accountant who I referred to as Thornton because he asked for his correct name to be withheld. And he had gone into Highgate Cemetery at around this time, really just to look around. It was a late afternoon, and at that time Highgate Cemetery was open to the public. Unfortunately, perhaps for Thornton, he became hopelessly lost, and he couldn't find his way back to the main path. He was quite near the large circle of tombs in the middle of the cemetery known as the columbarium, and he heard the bell go, and so he thought the best thing to do was just to make his way towards the sound of the bell at the main gate and find his way out that way. All of a sudden, Thornton became aware of something behind him. At this stage he didn't know exactly what it was, but he had an overwhelming sense that someone was watching him. And again he noticed that the temperature in the surrounding area had dropped quite considerably. He swung around and he described a tall, dark figure which was looking at him with intensity. He told me that it was almost as if this figure was trying to hypnotize him. In any event, he seemed to be losing control of his normal faculties. At this point, without warning, the figure suddenly vanished, and Thornton stumbled around in the cemetery, and eventually he found the main path, and he never returned. These were just two cases of people who had actually witnessed the Highgate vampire first-hand, and interestingly enough, both described the figure's eyes. They were hypnotic, and it's almost as if the figure was actually trying to cause harm to the people that it confronted, which is quite an unusual thing with many unexplained phenomena, because they don't usually try and harm their human counterparts. Not so with the case of the Highgate vampire. Well, naturally, I became intrigued by all these reports, and there were others. There were others too. And I decided to visit the cemetery one night. My main intention being to look around, to try and find some logical explanation for what had been seen. I didn't really know what I was looking for. I suspected it could have been maybe a large animal which descriptions had distorted. I even suspected that it could have been some very human person dressed up with the intention of frightening people. Whatever, it was around midnight, late in '69, and as I passed the top gate of Highgate Cemetery, I became aware. I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, and I looked up, or rather I looked around, and I saw a tall figure. It must have been about 7 feet tall. I couldn't tell, but it's almost as if it was floating just above the ground. But I distinctly saw its face, or rather, I saw two points of intense red light, which I took to be its eyes. At first, it was so real that at first I thought it was somebody dressed up as a vampire. But the area turned icy cold. It was almost as if you had stepped into a refrigerator. More important still, the figure, or whatever it was, seemed to be draining me of energy. I too seemed to be losing control of my normal faculties. The best way I can describe it is if I was living a vivid dream, and I wanted to wake up, but I could not. Realizing I was under intense psychic attack, I mentally repeated a Kabbalistic incantation which is used to repel potent evil forces. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was no longer there. It was after my sighting of the figure that I decided that the reports were indeed true. And we decided, that is, members of the British Psychic and Occult Society, decided to launch a full-scale investigation to try and find out what the phenomena was. As part of this investigation, we decided to check the history of Highgate Cemetery, and some interesting things came to light. For example, figures of a tall, dark figure could be traced back to Victorian times, when at that time it was described as a tall figure wearing a hat, and it used to disappear mysteriously through the cemetery wall. Another interesting thing that came to light, although we had no actual proof of this, but local rumour had it that Highgate Cemetery had been built upon the site of an old castle. Now this was especially interesting because many old buildings are constructed upon ley lines. Now ley lines are like lines of energy which crisscross the Earth's surface. But the interesting point here is that these lines of energy can actually trap psychic energy itself. Many old buildings were actually built on ley lines, such as old churches, abbeys, and these lines were marked by stone circles and stone markers. The point being that the ancient people were aware of the power of these lines. Now in the case of Highgate Cemetery, we discovered that the cemetery itself was situated directly on a ley line. The ley line appeared to start at the circle of tombs known as the columbarium. It then ran through the cemetery towards Highgate. But the next location on this ley line was the Flask public house, itself a very old coaching pub. The line then went on to traverse North Hill in Highgate, and the old Gatehouse pub, a pub dating back in fact to the 13th century, also fell on this ley line. The line then continued to run down across North Hill to a block of council flats now known as Hillcrest. The interesting point here is that Hillcrest itself was the site, or rather the site of Hillcrest used to house a large nunnery which was a home for unmarried mothers in Victorian times. After that, the ley line crossed Highgate Wood, and we also discovered that an old Roman settlement again fell on the ley line. Now the interesting thing here is that as ley lines can harbour psychic energy, we expected possibly to find other instances that had happened along this particular ley line. And sure enough, in the Flask public house, strange things have been happening over a period of years. Bottles would mysteriously explode, clocks would stop, and on quite a few occasions, bar staff and regulars themselves claimed to have seen a tall, dark figure. Now, in the case of the old Gatehouse pub, we again discovered that many things of a psychic nature had been happening there. Again, like Flask, objects would move mysteriously, lights would turn themselves on and off, clocks would stop, and again, people frequently reported seeing a tall, dark figure which suddenly, mysteriously disappeared. As a matter of interest, the gatehouse couldn't keep many staff for long, and certainly no one would venture down around the pub after closing time. Another thing is that one relief manager there, who took over temporarily, saw something horrendous, so much so that his hair turned white overnight. Needless to say, he left the pub almost immediately. Now again, where the line crosses what is now Hillcrest, a tall, dark figure has been spotted in the grounds. It has been seen by children playing there even in the daytime, and it mysteriously disappears. In one flat there, the psychic activity became so horrendous that the figure was not only seen, but it actually attacked, or rather psychically attacked, the occupants. Things got so bad that they had to call in the local vicar. He performed an exorcism in the flat, but it made no difference. Where the line crossed and still crosses the old settlement in Highgate Wood, there have again been reports of a tall, dark figure that disappears mysteriously amidst the trees. This figure has been seen over a number of years by many independent people. We therefore came to the conclusion that possibly, just possibly, the figure seen along the ley line could be the same as that had been witnessed at Highgate Cemetery. At this stage we were not quite sure. Another factor which came to light in the investigation at that time was that we discovered Highgate Cemetery was being used by a group of professional Satanists. We frequently discovered the remains of their rituals, and it would be a common thing to find the burnt down stubs of black candles and satanic markings on the floor of the tombs. In fact, one particular tomb in Highgate Cemetery, which was really more like a small chapel. There were no coffins in it, but it had a marble floor and stained glass windows, and it had been open for some time. We discovered in there the remains of one ritual on which an inverted pentagram had been inscribed on the chapel floor. There were signs of the moon, Saturn and Mars, which in that combination, they were extremely potent, and they had moved a large marble bust. It was almost as if they were trying to communicate with the spirit of the person It's perhaps important to explain here why satanic activity might be relevant to the appearances of the figure seen in the cemetery. Because by performing rites which involve black magic, it invariably involves the use of potent forces. And there was a possibility that these Satanists had actually activated, or perhaps reactivated, the psychic energy which was already dormant at Highgate Cemetery. Whatever, it is a fact that for some years before this, to my knowledge anyway, there had been no reports of the figure at Highgate Cemetery. Of course, by this time, the press had picked up the story, and local rumour and superstition had soon turned the tall, dark figure into a blood-sucking vampire. It was partly due to all this hysteria relating to vampires that we decided to conduct a séance inside Highgate Cemetery, the object being to try and communicate with it, whatever it was, and try and discover its purpose. For some reason, it seemed to be entrapped on the earthly plane. Accordingly, we entered Highgate Cemetery late one evening. There were a number of people present, and we had with us a psychic medium. We began by making preparations for this ceremony, and we cast 2 circles upon the ground. Around these were placed candles to represent the element of fire. We used burning incense, and we used little cups of water to represent the element of water. We cast a circle on the ground adjacent to the larger circle, where the entity would be summoned to appear, so the medium, the psychic medium rather, as she was trained in this field, could make communication with it. Unfortunately, this particular ceremony had to be abandoned because it was interrupted by media attention. But about a year later, we actually performed a successful ceremony inside Highgate Cemetery with a similar purpose in mind. I say successful, but in fact, it nearly had disastrous consequences. It was some time later, and we entered Highgate Cemetery at night with the same people. And this time, after preparing the ritual, a lady who was a trained medium said that it could be more effective if she stood inside a small circle, because it would help her communicate with the entity more easily. Sometime later, after making relevant incantations and other such things which I cannot really talk about, the girl clutched her throat and she could hardly breathe. We immediately broke the circle, and whatever it was, retreated. She said that when we actually got to the stage of trying to invoke the vampire, or the spirit, the vampire, whatever it was, she said the area in the circle turned cold. She felt she was losing the concentration, and next she said it was as if she was enveloped by a blackness and she could not see anything outside this circle. And then she distinctly felt that something was trying to strangle her. Now, this actually convinced us that the entity, or what had now become known as a vampire, was definitely malignant by nature. 2 other things which happened a little after this seem to back this up. A young university student was walking down Swains Lane late one evening, and he claimed, as he just passed the top gate, something pushed him with quite considerable force. He didn't actually see anything, but he felt this tremendous pressure, and again the area had turned icy cold. I interviewed this person, and I'm quite convinced he was telling the truth. It was only a little while after this that another attack occurred. A young nurse, who I believe worked at the Whittington Hospital, was returning there one evening from Highgate village, and as she walked down Swains Lane, just past the top gate, something pushed her. So much force was involved that she was thrown to the ground, and she ended up on her hands and knees, and her hands and knees were badly grazed. Now she looked up, and she described a tall, dark figure. She said it seemed as if it was wearing a cloak, and she also described its eyes. They were red. In fact, she described them as evil. At this moment, a car came down Swains Lane, and the figure, or whatever it was, disappeared in the glare of the headlights. The driver himself didn't actually see it, but seeing the state that the girl was in, he drove her to Highgate police station. Obviously, he didn't know about vampires or any such like. He thought she'd been attacked by a human being. The police made a complete search of the area, but unfortunately they could find nothing. Now the interesting point here is that at the place where the figure disappeared, Swains Lane was lined by 15-foot high walls. It is therefore quite difficult, if not inconceivable, to imagine how any human being could have disappeared so quickly. Also, at this time, perhaps as a result of the media coverage, other parties became involved in the investigation into the Highgate vampire. One particular group of people actually claimed to have located the vampire's tomb inside the columbarium. In fact, this group of people claimed to have actually seen the entity in its sort of vampiric sleep. Apparently they decided not to stake it, for reasons best known to themselves. But they sealed up the tomb, according to them, with garlic impregnated cement. At that time, they claimed that they put an end to the activities of the Highgate vampire. As a matter of interest, and it might be relevant, this same group of people later claimed that the vampire had escaped from the sealed vault and was operative in an old Gothic mansion which is actually situated in Avenue Road, which is quite near Crouch End. Just a mile or so, perhaps, from Highgate Cemetery. By amazing coincidence, or perhaps not, this house was in fact already under investigation by the BPOS, following reports of a ghost that had been seen there. We were looking into the possibility of some entity which we didn't really think was connected with Highgate Cemetery, but nevertheless it was claimed that the vampire now had been discovered in the old cellars of this mansion. It was claimed that the coffin was taken out to the back garden, the overgrown back garden of the mansion. There the vampire was staked through the heart, the wooden stake, and then it was claimed that petrol was poured over the coffin and it was set alight. Truly then, this would have seemed to have been the end of the Highgate vampire. Well, whatever the truth of what happened at the Gothic mansion in Avenue Road is perhaps something we will never know. But one thing is for sure, there were still reports of a tall, dark figure with red eyes that appeared to people at Highgate Cemetery. What the vampire actually was, is indeed, is something perhaps we will never know. Perhaps it is only a matter that can remain a speculation. As to the question of whether a vampire still exists at Highgate Cemetery, well, I can only say yes, it does.